Welcome to Clinical Academia Getting Started, a Manchester Catalys podcast. In this series, we're not just sharing stories, we're also tackling the challenges that clinicians face and highlighting the real opportunities available when starting out in research. In this episode, we're going to be focusing on physiotherapy, and we'll be talking about the barriers, the doubts, and the practical realities physiotherapists often face when embarking on clinical academic careers. Today, I'm joined by Professor Dawn Edge, a physiotherapist and professor in mental health and inclusivity at the University of Manchester, and Laura McGarrigle, an early career physiotherapy researcher based at Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust. So between you, we have both the experience perspective and also the current reality of what it is to be starting out in a clinical academic career. So Laura, let's start with you. So we're going to jump right in there. When you first thought about getting into research, what felt like the biggest barrier?
I've been thinking about this, and actually, initially, I didn't recognise or understand that there were any barriers. So that in my naivety, I'd done my undergraduate degree, I'd done a part-time master's whilst I was working, I'd progressed my clinical career, and I thought, I think I'd like to learn a bit more about research. I'll do a PhD. So I had a meeting with somebody from university and they started asking me questions. Well, how are you going to fund this? And how are you going to backfill your time? And who's going to supervise you? And I thought, well, I didn't know that I needed to consider any of those things. So it was then I just thought, well, I'm going to have to shelve this for now because I don't know the answers to these questions. So initially for me, it was not knowing what the potential hurdles and barriers might be. Then they became more obvious as I started to talk to more people and realise the structure I was going to have to try and put in place and how I was going to find funding. And that's when I started to learn more about the barriers. So the biggest barrier for me initially was not knowing what they were, because if I didn't know what they were, I couldn't try and address them or get support to address them. And that's where, through finding more support through different organisations and through MFT, that I then started to be able to think about how to address them.
So there's a lot of hidden barriers from the sounds of it, things that you didn't even know were there until you sort of started taking those steps. Were there any opportunities as well that were hidden in the same way, things that you didn't even know were sort of possible until you started taking steps into research career?
Yes, I didn't realise the number of organisations and research groups that existed and the schemes that they would run for people thinking about dipping their toe into research or wanting to learn more. So it's only when I'd had a few meetings with people that they then started to send me links to opportunities for internships or having some supervision with people and discussions and joining in with other people's research that I recognised they were potential options for me. And that was the real turning point for me once I'd recognised what support was there and some of the schemes that were running quite locally and things that were actually accessible. I just didn't know they existed.
Fantastic. Thank you, Laura. Dawn, I'm just wondering, thinking about both the barriers that Laura described and some of those opportunities, were things similar when you were getting started out in research, or was it different back then?
So similar insofar as not knowing the landscape and there not being a clear roadmap. And I think it's really interesting that, as Laura said, people saying, so where's your funding coming from? Where are you going to, who are your supervisors? And usually, well, certainly in my case, left you with the questions. Not, okay, so these are the things that you need to consider. This is where you can go and get the help. It was very much almost as though you somehow ought to have known these things. So I think to some extent things have changed. But you still have to know what's there. So I think there are more opportunities, so for example, most of my research is funded by the National Institute for Health and Care Research. They have an academy, they fund fellowships. But you're still not going to know that if you don't know that that's the thing, right? So somehow I think those barriers still exist about you don't know what you don't know. And I don't think there's enough yet particularly across allied health professions, to enable people to find a kind of a simple way in of knowing what the landscape is, knowing what the opportunities are, as well as understanding the barriers. Because as Laura says, once you understand what they are, then you can begin to tackle them.
Absolutely. Thinking about physiotherapists in particular, what do you think is the sort of number one thing that stops physiotherapists getting into research, like the number one barrier? Maybe Laura, I'll start with you.
I think it's the clinical demand on your time. And actually, from that perspective, it's just the headspace to even think about it. For most clinicians that I know, 99% of their time is firefighting clinical problems, patient demand, caseload. And I think to actually be able to have the headspace to think, this is something that I could fit into my role, where do I start? And trying to navigate how to juggle the demands of a clinical load, but also managing your academia and how you would even begin that is really difficult. And I know a lot of people that I talk to maybe don't feel they've got the managerial support. And I'm very lucky. I've always had a really supportive manager. And every time I've come to her and said, I think I might apply for this, she's been really positive and always backed me. And that's given me the opportunity to try and chase those things that I thought I would benefit from. But I think if no one's talking about that in your department, if your peers aren't talking about it or considering it, you can't see other people around you doing it. And within physiotherapy, particularly where I work, it's quite rare for you to see that. I think if you can see it in other people around you, it becomes something that you can then consider yourself.
Mm. Yeah, that's so interesting.
I think you're right about the systemic barriers and the attitudes to research. There are a lot amongst clinicians. There are a lot of clinicians who see research as a bit of a luxury, and that if you're doing that instead of real work, you're somehow copping out and leaving them with the burden, which is quite a paradox, given that we all talk about practicing evidence-based medicine, doing evidence-based practice. So where's the evidence supposed to come from unless we create it? And are we as physios going to continue to use evidence that's generated by other people, which may or may not be particularly relevant for our profession? Or are we going to enable our colleagues who are interested in research to do that work that will elevate research within the profession? And I think we haven't probably had that proper conversation, have we? And I think so it is a bit of a lottery if you're lucky, like someone like Laura, to have a manager who is willing to support you. But even that only goes so far. So she supported the courses and so on, but the time, the headspace to do the work, So with some other professions, you are actually given time. You're expected to do research. So it's factored into your work week. Whereas for physios and other allied health professionals, it's usually on top of, you're doing stuff at your weekends, you're doing it in the evenings, until you can get a bit of funding to buy out some of your time. And then you have a question of, well, who's going to do your job when you're not here? So even then, even if you bring the money in, you're somehow also responsible for backfilling your post. It's just one hurdle after another.
It is like you read my mind, because my next topic subject was going to be about the demands of balancing sort of clinical work and also research work. So sticking on this topic, I want to dig in a little bit deeper to it, because I hear this as well a lot from clinicians that I work with. And my tip to them is often about getting your time bought out, getting an internship opportunity that pays backfill, and there are several around, getting a pre-doctoral fellowship or a bridging fellowship, these kinds of things. I'm wondering, Laura, what tips do you give other clinicians?
I think that those schemes and fellowships and internships are really important. It is that buying out your time, because if you don't have the dedicated time to focus on it, you feel sometimes like you're just not progressing or taking things forward. So I started with an internship, and unfortunately that didn't come with backfill. I was supported from my manager to take some of the time, but in reality it was all done in my own time. And then I moved on to a pre-doctoral fellowship, which did buy out my time. Like Dawn's just mentioned, there were the barriers, not the barriers, there were the challenges of then trying to find someone to do the backfill. But actually that dedicated time away from clinical practice within a week to focus more allowed me then to actually make some progress and to create some outputs, to have some publications, and then that then set the ball rolling into the sort of the next fellowship. I think that was the real key for me in actually, I feel being embedded within the clinical practice is still really important. And for me, that's where I recognise the gaps of the evidence we need to fill. It's where I see what matters most to patients and where we should be focusing and trying to develop the evidence base. So having that link and still being embedded in clinical practice is important. But to drive forwards the research that supports and fills those gaps in the evidence base, you have to have that dedicated time. And recognising as well that by me stepping away for some days, it then was an opportunity for someone else to step into that clinical role and develop themselves. So it developed the whole team. And then I could feed my research knowledge into the team and support their opportunities to become involved too. So it did benefit the whole team, even though there were challenges in getting that set up initially.
Can I just bring another point in? So we've talked about the clinical role and we've talked about the research, but most of us have multiple roles, right? So outside of work and academia, we're often carers, and we've got lots of other responsibilities, and we know that that's not the society in which we live. That's not really equitably distributed. So women still carry a disproportionate burden for caring. And that means if you're trying to do this alongside your day job, on top of your caring responsibilities, you're already at a disadvantage. So trying to get research off the ground and develop a really active, vibrant research culture has to be led from somewhere else. It has to be led by people who have the power to create the environment and the atmosphere in which it's not seen as a luxury or you skiving off to do research, but actually something which is going to benefit the whole profession, both for those who are wanting to do research, providing the evidence base, but as Laura just said, also helping people with their career trajectory as people are stepping into new roles. So I think we need a shift in mindset and culture, and that obviously takes time.
Mm. Even when time is brought out, I think it can be challenging. I know myself, when I was doing my clinical psychology doctorate, I was in sort of 1 day a week was allocated to doing my dissertation. And I managed to do the legwork of sort of getting the data collected and all of that. I could not write it up because I just wasn't able to sort of get my head to focus clearly enough in a day to make hardly any progress. And thankfully, my course gave us 4 solid weeks with nothing else. And I wrote it in those 4 weeks, and I found that the time was so much more productive. But many clinicians just don't ever get that opportunity of 4 clear weeks to focus on writing up a piece of research. Do you have any tips? Maybe Laura, we'll start with you, for how you can make the most of when you have those really, what I feel are quite small amounts of time to do quite big thinking.
That's a difficult one. I think for me, it's been thinking and reflecting on how I work and learn best. So I recognise that I don't work best first thing in the morning. So I try and do all my bitty jobs, the emails and things like that initially, and then set aside a chunk of time the time of day for me that I'll work best. And talked about caring responsibilities. So that for me is when the children are at school. And I do sort of 4 compressed longer days. So I do have a day on a Wednesday where I'm not in clinical work. So it's finding the environment for me that helps me to focus more as well. So often that's not always at home, because then I get distracted by things that the children might need to have done or the housework. So again, stepping away from there or using a library somewhere is really helpful. So recognising what works for me better, and then having a really clear list of goals and breaking those down. But it is very hard. And I had someone advise me quite early on that 1 day a week is very hard, because by the time you've got your brain into gear and you've found your flow, then that day's over and you've got to wait another week. And they were advising about trying to have 2 consecutive days, or using your time more flexibly, like you said, to have those 4 weeks in one solid chunk. And I can see how that's really helpful. For me, I find having a balance within the week, fixed days where I know every week I'm going to get those fixed days works better for me. But again, everyone's different and people have to sort of find what works for them, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's a really important point about knowing what works for you. But I don't recall at school or any other part of my my learning education doing the work about knowing how I learn best and what my diurnal variations are and how best to use my time. I've had to learn that as part of the journey, and realizing that that with caring responsibilities, it's just not going to happen during the day. So rather than beat myself up, it's to do the things that I can do, which don't require 3 hours of solid getting your head into it. The emails, whatever, filing, stuff like that. And then setting aside time when the house is quiet. But then the downside of that is that sometimes you have extraordinarily long days if you're not careful, and then there is a risk of you getting burnt out. So one of the tips that I would give to people along this journey is to make sure you factor you in, and that includes having good breaks And if you've got small children, that's fabulous, because every 6 weeks you have an enforced break. And I think it's a good opportunity to think about how you do that as an early career researcher yourself. You take the time to make sure that you recharge. You step away from the books, close the books, may do a little bit of admin stuff, but no big thinking for a solid few days. And you'd be amazed at how much it re-energizes you when you come back.
No, that's fantastic advice. Thank you so much. I think there are quite a lot of misconceptions about clinical academia. Dawn, maybe I'll come to you first. What do you think that people often misunderstand about a research career, and maybe physiotherapists as well in particular?
Well, I think first and foremost, most of us don't even realise that it's a thing. Right? So the way health services research is set up is that very often it's done by people who are health services researchers. Or very often the clinicians who have the time or given the time to do the work are medics, because it's part and parcel of their training. So for the rest of us, it's not necessarily something that we label as that, because there's no culture for it. There's no system, there's no framework in which you can do it. So I think what Laura said is about role modeling. So when you see people who are doing it, and then you think, oh, all right, oh, and then you can maybe go and have conversations with them, or maybe you can start and find out about what is possible. But I think certainly for me, for a long time, I didn't know it was a possibility until at Wythenshawe Hospital I met a physiotherapist who was doing world-leading research into cystic fibrosis. I didn't know that was possible.
That's an amazing story. I think sometimes those role models are so important, just to open up, I guess, lift the ceiling a little bit. Laura, how about you? Has there been anything that surprised you about clinical academia?
I think actually, and I'm very lucky to work within a big organisation like MFT, but what I never realised was the amount of people working within research, within the trust, and the layers of governance that are involved, and the people that are actually there to support you when you reach out and ask for help. I didn't recognise how much funding is needed and where that goes, and just having done a fellowship application and having to break down all those costs into the minute details, I didn't recognise also the support I would get with that. Because of it feels a little bit, I feel like when you're a clinician, that research department sort of sits quite separately. And unless you're already involved, or somebody says, actually come and be involved with this work I'm doing, you don't really see that. And a lot of work goes on in the background. So for me, making some links and getting some support from the research department, it opened my eyes to really what goes on behind the scenes, the number of people supporting with just day-to-day things like data collection, but then supporting fellowship applications, and actually really trying to embed that research across the trust. That surprised me, but it also then allowed me to see that the support is there if you sort of know where to go and where to ask for it.
But it's that knowing where to go, isn't it? So there are kind of there is infrastructural support, but for example, the library. So most research active trusts have a really, really good library and information system, and they will have people who can help support you to do literature searches and so on. But if you don't know that, you can very much fall into that, I've got to do this all myself, and not realise that the help that's available. Most organisations that are research active will also have links to small pots of money, the kind of things that will enable you to do some initial work to scope out what might be possible, or to do some work where you are engaging with members of the public or other, PPIE, patient public involvement, to find out what their views about what you want to do. So we are MFT, so we're part of the Manchester Biomedical Research Centre. A lot of clinicians don't know what that is and might walk past the building with a label, but they don't know what that is, and they don't know what the BRC can do for them. So I think there's more that maybe that we can do as an organisation. This is not just about MFT, it's across the board, where we bring some more of this into people's attention. And that's why I think I'm really delighted to be here doing this, because I think it's a great way of saying to people, there are all these things around you and people around you that are willing to help. And we know that you don't know about them. So here we're going to give you some tips for how you can get engaged and get involved in research.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned library services, and I just have to do a little shout out for Manchester University NHS Foundation Trust. MFT Library is amazing. But I know other trusts as well will have a similar thing. Definitely worth reaching out to them. Really helpful, and lots of skills there.
Yeah.
So just moving us on a little bit. So one of the things that has surprised me when having conversations with clinical academics is the number of people who tell me that they struggle with imposter syndrome. So Laura, let's start with you. Have you ever felt like you didn't quite belong? Because that's the heart of imposter syndrome, isn't it? This idea of not belonging. Have you ever experienced that?
I think very early on in the very first internship I did. But I think when you very first start something like that, it can feel quite overwhelming in general. And I maybe did feel that briefly, but I was very lucky to have a very supportive supervisor who not only supported me with the academic side and developing my own research ideas, but recognised me as a human being with children and other commitments and other experience. And actually, I started to realise that, no, I'm not an expert in what I'm doing right now, but I am an expert in my clinical area, and then that I had some skills to bring. And I would say, yes, that imposter syndrome raises its head. And I'm lucky enough to be a co-chair of an early career research support group within MFT. And it's something that people talk about a lot. And it takes different forms in different people. But for me, it still is there. But I just recognise it now. And I try and look back on things that I have achieved when I think, I'm not qualified enough to do this, or I just have to recognise where I am now and and where I've come from. And I think a lot of people say the same thing to me, and that in that moment in time, they don't feel like they maybe should be there, but actually recognising what skills you do have, and that might not be in exactly what you're doing at that moment in time research-wise, but recognising the skills that you do have. It's difficult, and I think it does raise its head in different scenarios. But as I get older and as I get more experience in my career, I'm learning to feel more comfortable with saying, I don't know. And I think that's a big part for me now, is recognising that I can say and I can ask other people, and just recognise, actually, I don't know this, but there are people I can go to, or I can read something, and just sitting with that feeling becomes more comfortable as time goes on for me.
Yeah, I think that's amazing advice. And I think that can benefit you, not just as an individual, having those sort of clear lines in your mind. I'm good at this, that I don't know yet. It benefits you. It also benefits other people around you, because I think when people start being honest and able to be honest about what they do and don't know, it sort of stops people wearing masks, and we can all suddenly start communicating more honestly and freely. And I think it paves the way for psychological safety, I think, in groups. How about you, Dawn? Is imposter syndrome anything that you've ever struggled with?
So I've been the perpetual outsider, being a Black woman in predominantly white spaces, predominantly often male-dominated spaces. So I think when you're faced with that lived reality, you have one of two choices. One, you can feed the beast and continue to feel less than, or you begin to understand the uniqueness that you bring. And once you begin to value that, I'm not telling you that everybody else is going to get it and everybody else is going to see it. I still get occasions where people, mistake me for, I don't know, the tea lady or the whatever, that happens to nearly all of us at some point. But it's knowing who you are and being able to hold on to that will enable you to go into those rooms, take the deep breath, feel the fear and do it anyway, and go in and being your authentic self. And that's something else that I've had to learn to grow into. I think, as Laura said, it's a growing experience. One of the reasons why I loved my PhD, it felt like every day was a day at school in a good way. I was learning stuff and I was soaking it all up. But the reality is that we live in a world which is unequal, where there is discrimination, where there are people who don't value what you bring and will tell you it's not valued in subtle and not so subtle ways. And some of them, I think at times, think they're being quite benevolent. They think they're being quite kind. So I remember at one point being told that if I wanted to really progress and be taken seriously, I had to straighten my hair. I couldn't have hair like this because important people don't have hair like this. Yeah. So this is one of the reasons why it's so important, I think, for me to be visible. But with that also comes the downside where sometimes when you're very visible, you get the, who do you think you are? How did you get there? Who put you there? Who opened, so there's no sense in which you've done any of this by your own hard work and the long nights and the childcare and juggling and all of that stuff. It's somehow somebody must have done it for you, because there is at the heart of that statement the belief that you can't possibly. People like you don't do things like this, which is what I've heard pretty much all my life. And I'm like, okay, well, we'll see then.
Well, there's so much there, and I'm not sure what I want to pick up on first, but the comment about your hair, I suppose I find that really shocking that anyone would feel that they had the right to make such a comment. Do you think that people are, Black women are still experiencing comments like that today?
I would be surprised if they're not. And not just women, girls, there's still fights on for Black children not to be excluded from school for having, I'm going like this, extreme hairstyles, particularly Black boys. It's still a thing, marginalisation, discrimination, prejudice, stereotyping people, racism, it comes in many, many forms. And so, and including internalized. So this person that was saying this to me about my hair was another Black person, and she genuinely thought that she was saying something kind that was going to be helpful. But it's about knowing yourself, really, knowing that this is, I know you mean well, but actually that's not serving either you or me.
And I'm interested because I'm wondering if there might be somebody listening to this who has been in a similar situation or wonders if they might be. What advice would you give for them in responding to that comment or a comment like it?
And just to be fair, it might not be about your hair. It could be because you have a visible disability. It could be because of your body shape, or there can be a whole range of different things where people, because of their mindset, somebody who does research probably looks like a caricature of an Einstein figure, right? Somebody with a white coat and curly white hair and a male, and they don't look like people like Laura and me. So and often it's not so much in the saying, for me, I think, it's increasingly in the being. Being there as a living embodiment of all the things that people tell you can't do and why you don't belong, and going, well, that's your opinion, you're entitled to that, but that's not going to define who I am, and it's not going to limit the choices that I make and the spaces that I choose to occupy.
I also just want to rewind to what you were saying earlier, because it sounded to me like what you were effectively saying is that we need to value ourselves and not wait for other people to value us. And I think that's so important, because if we're waiting for the world to tell us that it loves us, we're not going to be changing the world, right? No. And that's what we want to be doing as clinical academics. What advice would you give to people? And I know this is such a big question, but any brief ideas on how people can learn to value themselves more, to shore themselves up for, I suppose, the storms that academia inevitably throws at all of us?
So just going back to something that Laura said earlier on, it's about thinking about your whole self. The research, the academia is only one element of who you are. There's the foundational stuff that if you were blessed, and I know some of us haven't been, you've had great parenting, you've got a wide social network, and I know that's not the case for everybody. But if you've got that as your foundation, it's a bit like climbing Everest. Not that I've ever done that, but you know what I mean. So from what I know is that one of the things that is fundamental to being able to climb the mountain is establishing base camp, is having somewhere that's safe and secure, where all your basic needs are taken care of. And so whether that's your own home where you look after your family, or they look after you. It's your faith, it's your friendship group, it's your network. People who value you for who you are and not for what you do or your titles.
Yeah, that's fantastic advice. Laura, is there anything you want to add to that in terms of, just things you can do to shore yourself up?
I think reflection, I agree with absolutely everything you've said. I think that's really important. And I recognise maybe the privilege that comes alongside with some of the things. I've got a really supportive husband, great social support, a job with a salary and all those things. And I recognise that for some people that's very different. I think for me, I try to reflect quite regularly and think back and look from where I've come. But it's a difficult one, isn't it? Because I think if you're the sort of personality that thrives in an academic environment, you're always looking, what comes next? And I feel like sometimes I'm guilty of sort of chasing that next thing that will define my progress.
And not celebrating, not stopping to celebrate and give yourself a pat on the back.
That's a really good point. I feel that having the peer network that we have with MFT, and it's nurses, midwives, AHPs, and we get together every sort of 6 weeks or so. And it's only brief, but that's another opportunity where people can recognise the work that each other have done, recognise and celebrate your successes, and just have an awareness of what else is going around and the good work that people are doing, and things like podcasts and looking back at what other people have achieved and where they've come from, and maybe seeing a bit of you within that. And it's quite inspiring. So I think for me, it's a combination of all those things, really.
Oh, that's fantastic. Thank you, Laura. In my role as Catalys Director, I often meet with clinicians who are right at the very start of their research careers. They're trying to step over the threshold into research, but their foot is still in the air. Laura, can you share with us what were your very first steps into research?
My very first step was a failure. And looking back on it now, that was actually the real key thing that happened to me. I applied for sort of a fellowship. It was an internship sort of level. And I looked at the inclusion criteria and thought, oh yeah, I meet these. I've got a master's degree. I'm keen. I've got an idea of what I want to do. And I applied for it and wasn't successful without even an interview. So then I was lucky enough to get some feedback from somebody, and we sat down, and actually I recognised, all these things that I need to think about and go away and do. And getting that feedback was the most important thing for me, because it showed me the areas I needed to think about, to plan a bit more, to have a bit more of a firm idea where the support supervisors and things needed to come from. So that very initial step wasn't a forward step, but it actually took me there in the end. So then, because of this person I'd met for some feedback, they then highlighted another internship opportunity, which was much more appropriate for me. And I was lucky enough to get that. And there I found, like I talked about before, the supervisor that really believed in me, and we worked together really closely, and we ended up working together for over 3 years. And that scenario just really helped me to look forwards and where I was going to go next. But I was still at the initial stages of that internship thinking, well, I'm learning lots now, but I don't think I can go any further than this. This is it, really. But then I realised the work I'd done and what I'd achieved during that time. And actually at the end of that internship, we had to present a poster on what we'd learned and done during that time. And again, it was that reflection of, oh, look what I've managed to do here. Okay, maybe I can take that next step. So initially for me, it was I call it a failure, but that doesn't upset me, because actually that was then the catalyst for the next stage of what was to come.
That's fantastic. And again, you've already stepped into the next thing I was going to be asking you about, which is dealing with setbacks. I think for some people, absolutely, clinicians stepping into research, setbacks can come at the very beginning. For all of us, I think setbacks come all the way through. What is your advice for somebody who is experiencing setbacks? How can they recover emotionally to carry on?
I think you have to sit with that feeling of failure to start with. I think that's important. And I've had that. So I've had that example I gave you before, but also submitting a piece of work to a journal and having an immediate rejection. I think I sat with that for a little while, and then maybe talked to some people about it, and again recognised that that's quite normal within academia. And I spoke to some colleagues that had similar experiences. And then it's like, okay, well, what's next? So then it's okay, let's go on a sideways tangent, and what else could I apply for, and where else could I submit my work to? So recognizing what I tried to achieve, that it wasn't successful, thinking about why that was. And in this situation, I'd submitted to a fairly high impact journal. I thought, why not? Let's have a go. And they said that my work didn't quite fit with their theme. And that was absolutely fine. And then I went away and tried to find something that did suit it a bit more. And then that was successful. So I feel that understanding that it is common, that it happens to people, listening to other people's experiences and seeing how they responded to it. I think you need, like we talked about already, you need a solid support network, friends, family, and time away as well, to have a holiday, to actually shut your books for a while, recognise that life carries on and that it is your career and it is a passion and it's something that you feel really passionate about and you really believe in that work, but it is just part of the whole picture. And that whilst that one might be shelved for a while, that you're then going to go on and develop in other areas. And that's, again, why I really like the balance of the clinical work, because I can have a rejection one day, but later on that afternoon, go and see somebody in critical care who's really struggling to recover, support them, and realise that my worth isn't just because of a paper that I've submitted to a journal, and that my work is important in other ways too. So having a balance really helps me with that.
So in some ways, clinical academia, whilst loading people up with greater amounts of stress because you're balancing both academic stuff and clinical stuff, that can pay off too. If the academic stuff is going badly, which in my experience it often is, you have another outlet and another way of, I suppose, expressing your professional self, which can bring rewards.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's really important.
I mean, Dawn, you've been in this line of work for a long time now, and I know that you've overcome a number of sort of setbacks. What's your experience of overcoming setbacks, and what advice would you offer people?
I do think, Laura's absolutely right about taking space and time to reflect, and sometimes doing that with other people and having the conversation about, like, you know, with that failing forward, looking at the application and going, what do I need to do differently? Because, as I say to PhD and other students that I supervise, you wouldn't need a supervisor if you knew what you were doing. The whole point of a PhD is you're doing research training. A handful of people are going to do research that changes the world. Most of us are going to learn how to do research better. And yes, we'll make a contribution to the field by getting papers published, and you may be lucky that your work may be cited by nice clinical guidance or some other thing. But really what it sets you up to do is to be a better researcher and to be a better clinician by being better able to use research evidence to inform your practice. So, yeah, I don't know if that answers your question, really. I think the important thing is to learn from each setback, to take the time to do that. And one of the things, this sounds like I'm back at school, but one of the things that I used to do is I'd get the feedback from the journal that said, we regret to inform you, and I just stop at that. Or I would read it and I would just read all the negatives. And I started to physically print off the feedback, and I would have 2 colored pens, and I would literally go through and highlight all the positive stuff first, all the greens. So what are the things that they said about the paper that were really good? And then go back, because before I would just focus on all the negative things and think it was just really hopeless and there's no point. And nearly all the time there was more positive than negative, and that would be the thing that would enable me to think, okay, so they're saying they need more of this, so we need to tweak it and change it, or maybe it's not a good fit for this journal because. So again, as part of that learning, understand that different journals have different scope. Didn't know that at the beginning. That sometimes there are special editions where your work that might be seen as being quite niche somewhere else actually fits, that you can actually pitch an idea for a special edition. There are all these things that you don't know that at the beginning, but you learn them as you go along the journey. And the other thing is that you can write to the editor and disagree with them. I never knew you could do that. You know, with humility and good grace, a challenge, and just ask them for clarification about why they've rejected your paper, or you said this, however, and you don't have to just take it all on the chin. You can learn how to write good letters to editors.
That's fantastic. That's a really good point as well, actually, about being able to pitch special editions. I don't want to gloss over it, because I'm wondering if there may be somebody listening whose ears just pricked up and now they're thinking, what? Tell me more. Can you just explain that for anyone who wasn't aware of that?
Oh, right, okay. So generally speaking, journals, so like in clinical research journals, they will publish a range of different kinds of papers. But every now and again, they would actually, sometimes journals themselves put out a call. Or there may be something that there's a lot of stuff happening in that space, and there are enough people that you might know who are doing similar work that it's worthwhile asking about commissioning a special edition. So it may be, I've got some colleagues that we did one around offender health and looking at what happens to older people in prisons, because that's quite specific, isn't it? And there's an area that a lot of people haven't thought about. But, if you've been given a life sentence, at some point you're going to be in prison and be elderly. And what if you've had a stroke, or you develop Parkinson's disease, or you develop dementia? Or how does the prison service deal with that when you're in prison for the rest of your life? So, and then on top of that, you layer being a woman, or you layer things about your religious practice. All of those things that then become quite hidden within the system, but actually they are detrimental to other people's, to those prisoners' health and well-being, and their right to access, at the very least, good primary care, but also to be able to access services. That being in prison doesn't take away your right to those things, but often it does, because nobody is highlighting that. So yeah, that's the kind of thing where you could write a special edition, and it could be about anything, couldn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great tip there. Just coming back to what we were talking about before, about first steps into research. Dawn, what advice do you give people when they come to you saying, I'm a clinician, and I really would like to, I see this as a problem and I want to make a difference, but I don't know where to start. What do you say, or what would you say?
So I'm going to answer that by telling you about an amazing service it's now called Research Support Service, but it used to be called RDS, Research Design Service. And they were set up, there's a whole range of different things that they did, but I got involved with RDS when they did a specific intentional piece of work of going into the NHS. Really weren't doing social care there so much. We are doing that now. And talking to people about research and how they could become research active. And RSS is now Research Support Service, has a whole scheme of research advisors. And you can go and talk to them about your research idea. It doesn't even have to be a fully formed idea, just a glint of an idea. And they can then help you with shaping that into a research question, thinking about your methodology. They can even signpost you to people who, not just signpost you, but actually introduce you to people who may be potential collaborators. If you need specialist methodological advice, they can do all of that. So I guess it goes back to our conversation right at the beginning, where there are people there who are able to help, but if you don't know that they exist, you can't reach out to them. But just to reassure you that if you're at that very first step, there are people you can talk to. I'm sure there are people like Laura who may not be quite as scary as reaching out to somebody who's a Professor X or whatever. Somebody else who you can go and talk to. PhD students are great people to go and have conversations with, because they're not so far removed. They remember what it was like at the very beginning. But yeah, RDS, or RSS as they're now called, is definitely. And the library, we mentioned the library, going to people like that, going to it's not called library services anymore, is it? I don't know what they're called properly, but knowledge exchange or hub at your trust, and going to talk to the people there who can tell you whether the thing that you're thinking about has already been done. So you need to think about it differently.
Yeah, it's important to know. That's really helpful. Thank you, Dawn. We'll put a link to the RSS in the show notes for people.
And the knowledge exchange, or it's called the library.
Yes, we can do that too. Brilliant. Thank you. So as we come towards the end of our time and we begin to land, I'm keen to know, and Laura, I'll come to you first. What are your 3 top tips for somebody who is starting out in research?
I've struggled to keep it to 3, I think. I think from a practical point of view is knowing the evidence base in your area first and reading a lot. And I think that's such a good foundation, because by reading as much as you can you've got a good idea of different methodologies, the literature in your field, and then you can start to identify where the gaps are. Because I imagine there's nothing worse than thinking I've got a great research idea and then finding it's already been done and you've already put work into trying to develop that idea. So reading a lot and getting really comfortable with the academic language, with the way that people write, because again, that putting pen to paper is quite hard, and thinking, you're trying to shoehorn your thoughts into an academic language that feels very alien. So I think the more that you read, the more that becomes sort of second nature. So reading and knowing your evidence base, having some sort of support from someone who is like maybe a step ahead down the line, like you just give an example there of a PhD student, because you maybe don't feel as silly asking them some of those silly questions that in theory don't exist, but you still feel really silly when you ask them. And they can probably signpost some of the real practical things and also just have that conversation around, yeah, that happened to me as well. That's quite normal. So having somebody that you feel really comfortable to talk to, and that can be quite difficult to find with the support group that we've now got, the peer network, that's really great at linking people up. So I think if something like that doesn't exist in your organisation, even just an informal way of finding some other people with that interest that you can have discussions with. And then we've done things like ask the library to come and present to us about what they can offer. We've had people who've supported PPIE projects to come and talk to us, and all those little nuggets of knowledge become more accessible, particularly when you're surrounded by people at a similar level of experience. You feel comfortable to ask the questions. So they're my first two. And the third one is to try and really believe in yourself and to find the work and to find the gap and the project that you want to work on that you feel really passionate about, because you know the reality of it is that you are going to have to do some of this work in your own time, and you're going to have to get your laptop out at weekends and evenings, and to really get yourself to do that, you've got to really feel passionate about it. And for me, that's embedding my research in the clinical problems that I see and involving patients in designing and developing that research. And I hear from them what the problems they want to try and solve and develop the answers to. So the passion in what you're trying to study and what you want to learn is really important.
That's some great advice. Thank you. Dawn, how about you? What are your 3 tips?
Wow. I don't think I can follow that very well. But I think, what was that book that was written a while ago? Was it Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway? And that is across the piece. So dipping your toe in the water, you really don't know how deep it is. So coming up with an idea and being willing to share that with other people can be quite scary, whether you're saying it out loud or whether you're writing down on paper. You don't know whether they're going to laugh or think it's ridiculous. So there is that taking that first step. But also along the journey, you're going to have those moments where you're going to have to put the pen to paper and write that article and get it sent off. You're going to have to go for, if you've done yours yet, Laura, where you do a continuation viva, where you're going to have to be in a room and talk to people about your PhD study and about why you're doing it and what it means and what you hope to do with what you find. And then obviously further on down the line, when you've completed your PhD or your doctoral study of whatever kind, you'll have another viva voce where you're going to have to go and talk to people about your work. So but along that journey, there are other opportunities to talk to people about your work, which could really help to prepare you. So, going to doctoral academy students forums where they do that kind of have those kind of conversations, you get the opportunity to talk about your work to a relatively small and a relatively friendly and a supportive group of people who will give you the kind of feedback and the confidence to take it to a bigger audience. And I think the other thing is self-belief. And for many of us, that is a challenge because life's journey might have made that quite a difficult thing to acquire. But at some point, knowing that what you're doing matters becomes really important as a vehicle for moving you forward. And so I think there are times when you're absolutely going to think, why on earth did I start this? What made me think I could do this? And then it's like doing the bites, the thing about eating the elephant is one bite at a time, not trying to do everything all at once, but recognizing that this is big. It's necessarily big. It should be, but it's doable. And that's when you look at other people who are doing it, or a little bit further ahead than you are, or people who have done it, and think, okay, so what did they do? And that's when they have a bit of the fear of doing it anyway, is going to talk to people who you might think are a bit scary, and you'd be surprised by how welcoming they are and how nice they are. I'm not telling you you're not going to find people who are not so nice, because we live in the real world. But generally speaking, I have been astounded by how welcoming and open people are.
That's fantastic advice. Thank you. So down to my final questions. Laura, if someone is listening and thinking, I'm not ready, what would you say to them?
Again, it's a very personal one, isn't it? And I think it's looking at why that person feels that they're not ready, because it's important to recognise that there are maybe periods in your life when it's not a great time to start something big and new. So maybe we're trying to look at where that feeling comes from. Is it just a self-confidence thing? Do they need some more support? Do they need just to join up with somebody else's project for a while and just have a taster? Does that help their confidence, and then all of a sudden they feel like they're ready? Or is it because something else big is going on in their organisation or with their stability at home? But I think in a lot of cases, the majority of people will have that sort of feeling. But if you're interested and you've thought about it and you're saying it, then you probably are more ready than you realise. And you need to probably reflect on what skills you bring from other areas in life. You know, especially if you're a clinician, you're already probably really well organised, you communicate well, you work in a busy health system, you're used to juggling a lot of things. So recognise the skills that you've got from other areas of life and think about how that's going to support you going forwards into something that feels more uncertain and tricky.
That's really good advice. Sometimes I think when you're in that situation, it can be helpful to sort of remind yourself that other people as well might not feel ready, but if they get started and you don't, then you're going to be sort of missing time and losing time, and that there's not much to lose in having a go.
Absolutely.
Dawn, what if someone is unsure? So they think, I just don't know if I'm sort of a research type person, if I'm going to enjoy this or not. What advice would you give to them?
There is no such thing as a research type person. There's no one type. There's no model. There are many different types of people who end up in doing research, including increasingly people with lived experience. And some of us are both. So some of us are clinicians and we want to do research, but we also have lived experience of whether it's a physical health condition or mental health challenge. And that can inform the kind of work that we do. There is a balance to be struck, but I think that's often quite having some kind of personal connection to the work that you're interested in. Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be you or within your family, but something that you see as being a gap that you recognise, like with Laura's circumstances in her practice, something that they just don't know, and if they could understand this better, it would improve the way you do physiotherapy. Maybe it's developing a new scale, a new measure or something. I think that's the big thing for me, is that there isn't any one type. And so there is many different approaches to research as the kind of research that needs to be done. And maybe, just maybe, your USP is seeing things from a different perspective, because no one else like you is doing what you're doing. No one else is a bit like the boy, in the story of the Emperor's New Clothes, was going, isn't he naked? Isn't he? Is it just me? I don't think that's what I'm seeing at all. And being willing to speak up, and then that can lead you into doing research which is very different, which of course comes with its own challenges, because people will tell you that it's too niche, that it doesn't have any real value, but you then have to find your tribe of people who are going to support you along the journey.
Yeah, often the best, most impactful research is the research that's the hardest to do.
Yeah.
Because, I think researchers have seen something that the rest of us are not yet seeing, like the Emperor's New Clothes situation. Brilliant. Well, thank you both so much for joining us for Clinical Academia Getting Started, a Manchester Catalys podcast. If you're listening and thinking about getting started in research, we hope this episode has shown you that while there are challenges, there are also so many opportunities. There isn't just one path, there are many paths. And if you're interested in research, there's a good chance that the research world and the wider world needs what you have to bring. So if you've enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe. It helps improve us in terms of the algorithm. And you can also follow us, Manchester Catalys, on Instagram, on YouTube. We regularly advertise research funding opportunities, research training opportunities, and inspirational videos to encourage you on your research journey.